Hello and welcome to the History of Modern Greece. I'm your host, Daniel Roberts, and I'm here with my father, George, and our theme music is brought to you by Mark Youngerman. This is a podcast that covers the events from the fall of ancient Greece to the modern day. This is episode 4, Jason and the Argonauts. Now, before we can jump into the story of Jason and the Argonauts, I want to give you a little background on who the crew was on this boat. Now, arguably the most famous person who was on the Argos was a man named Heracles, otherwise known as Hercules. Heracles was a demigod. His father was a god, and his mother was a human. But his father wasn't just any god. His father was Zeus. Zeus loved his wife Hera, but he also loved taking small excursions down to Earth to wander amongst the humans. He had children with many human mistresses, and this angered Hera. She couldn't stop Zeus directly, so she directed all of her wrath towards Zeus's mistresses and bastard children. One of these women that Zeus fell in love with was the wife of a king who was off fighting in a war. Zeus flew down to earth and took the shape of her husband and made sweet love to her, impregnating her with the seed of a god. The child inside of her belly grew and her stomach started to show. When the king returned and saw his queen was with child, he knew she had cheated on him. He ordered his army to build a bonfire in the town, and he was about to burn her alive when Zeus flew down from the sky and told the entire city that it was he, Zeus, who had fathered the child. The king was honored that he was going to raise the child of Zeus, and so he pardoned his wife. The child was born, and the queen named him Heracles, after the goddess Hera. However, the Romans called him Hercules. Almost immediately, Hera started messing with this baby's life. While he was resting in his crib, Hera sent 2 snakes to kill him. The queen woke up in the middle of the night to screaming, and she ran into the nursery, only to find the baby Heracles strangling 2 dead snakes in his hands. The queen was afraid of further wrath from the goddess Hera, so she abandoned the baby in the forest. However, Hera was a god who cared for small creatures. It's this which allowed Zeus to trick her in the first place when he turned into a cuckoo. When she saw a strong baby alone in the forest, she picked him up and breastfed him. The little baby is said to have sucked the milk out with such strength that it caused Hera to pull back in pain, and the milk that shot out from her breast stained the sky and created the Milky Way. And now that baby Heracles drank the divine milk of Hera, he developed divine powers himself. Athena saw the baby with Hera and took the child and returned him to his mother. When Hera realized that she had suckled the child of her husband's mistress, she lost her mind. She had never been so angry and vowed to destroy this young demigod. But her greatest mistake was breastfeeding him, as it gave him extraordinary powers. Heracles was back at home with the king and queen, and they made sure to give him the best education money could buy. He was trained to ride chariots and to fight as well as to play music. The young man was given everything, but he had an uncontrollable temper. You see, he did not like being corrected, even if he knew he was wrong. When his teacher hit him with a stick because he wasn't paying attention in class, the young Heracles beat his master to death with his musical instrument. Heracles was put on trial for murder, but was let go because they determined the teacher had it coming. I don't know how, but that's what they decided. But needless to say, Heracles was a maniac an uncontrollable teen with crazy anger issues. He was put in the fields to work it off. And in the fields, he grew into the strongest man the world had ever seen. His cattle were constantly under threat from lions, so Heracles set out to hunt down this terrible beast. He found the lion and killed it in a cave. And then he skinned it and wore its fur as clothing. Heracles ended up going on adventures throughout Greece and ran into a tax collector who was ravaging the people of Thebes. This man was stripping the wealth away from the people to pay off his own debts. And Heracles stood up for the people and went to war against this man. And in this battle, Heracles defeated his enemy. But unfortunately, his stepfather was killed in the fighting. After this war, Heracles returned home. And he spent time with his wife and children. And for the first time, he found himself happy. Happy to be with his family. Hera, the goddess of the sky, looked down on her husband's bastard and plotted against him. She was always watching Heracles, and now that he was finally happy, she was able to exact her revenge. She planted inside of Heracles the seed of madness. Heracles went into a daze, and soon he saw monsters all around him. Multi-headed serpents started thrashing at him, snapping their jaws, trying to nip at his arms and legs, and Heracles went berserk and attacked the beasts around him, thrashing and punching and kicking and tearing at every head of the serpent around him. And once the beast was dead, Heracles' mind returned to normal, and he found himself sitting in his home with blood all over his hands and all over the floor. He had just killed, but what did he kill? Was it the multi-headed serpent? No. Heracles had murdered his wife and children. He destroyed everything in his life that gave him happiness. Heracles went into a great depression, and he left his home, and he ended up wandering the countryside of Greece. And it is after this terrible event that Heracles got himself into the many adventures of Hercules. Zeus was out and about when he spotted a beautiful queen on the side of a pond. She was admiring the birds in the water, so Zeus transformed himself into a swan and flew into the pond, landing right in front of the queen. He strutted his feathers and danced around the queen, who grew infatuated with the swan. And as the swan cozied up next to the girl, she felt the softness of the feathers and snuggled up beside him. Zeus then forced himself upon the girl. And the weird part is, he did this still in his swan form. And as a swan, he raped the queen and impregnated her. And her belly grew with 2 babies. However, when she went to give birth, she didn't have live babies. Instead, she forced out 2 eggs. Now, the eggs matured and eventually they hatched. And inside the first egg was a baby girl and boy named Helen and Pollux. They were the children of Zeus. The second egg hatched, and inside was Castor and Clytemnestra. Their father was mortal. Now the king found it strange that his wife laid eggs instead of humans, and even stranger when the eggs hatched humans. But he knew it was because of Zeus, so he decided to raise all 4 children as his own and treat them equally. Clytemnestra ended up marrying the king of Mycenae, the great king Agamemnon. Castor and Pollux ended up going off on their own adventures, while Helen grew into the most beautiful woman in the world. Her beauty was so great that every king in the world wanted her as his queen. Now, Castor and Pollux are very important to the story because they are the twins mentioned in the first episode. These are the same twins that appear in every Indo-European religion. They are depicted in their sculptures with two horses. Castor and Pollux were twins, but they had different fathers. Castor was the mortal son of Tyndareus, the king of Sparta, while Pollux was the divine son of Zeus. Now, this was a strange relationship, one twin being mortal and the other being immortal. It reminds me of the movie Twins with Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger. But to really get into the story of Castor and Pollux, we must start the story with another individual, with a man named Jason.
Jason's father was named Aeson, and he was from Thessaly, and just so happened was next in line to become the king. Before he could become king, his brother overthrew him and had Aeson locked up. However, Aeson's wife was pregnant, and the child, if born male, could be a challenger to the new king's reign. When Aeson's wife went into labor and saw that she had a son, she wept, for she knew her brother-in-law was going to have her son killed. So she instructed her handmaidens to exit the birthing room, with their hands covering their faces while they wept and cried. This tricked the spies watching them, and the king assumed Aeson's wife had a miscarriage, but the baby didn't die. The mother named him Jason and sent him off where he could be safe from the king. Jason was raised outside of the city by a centaur named Chiron. Chiron wasn't just any centaur. He was a teacher of all men destined for great things. He taught kings and heroes and demigods how to use the bow gracefully and how to think philosophically. He was relatively unknown for most of his younger life. That is until the city he lived outside of was plagued by a large boar, and an official hunt was called to rid the city of this beast. Many heroes and strong warriors participated in this hunt, but it was the young Jason who slayed the beast. After that, he became well known throughout the lands of Thessaly. After gaining his fame, he decided it was time to head back to the kingdom of his father. His uncle was still king and would probably kill him on sight, but Jason wasn't afraid anymore. While Jason was in exile, his uncle Peleus ruled over the kingdom. However, he always lived in fear. Peleus stole the throne from his brother. He was a traitor and not to be trusted, and therefore he lived in constant fear that someone would usurp him, just as he had usurped the previous king. To deal with his paranoia, Peleus went to the oracle. If anyone could calm him down, it was the oracle. Just a quick side note. A lot of Greek myths start with people going to the oracle, and it always turns out terrible. This time the oracle told Peleus to fear the man with one sandal. It was a vague prophecy, but one that Peleus heeded nevertheless. While Jason traveled home, he crossed an old woman trying to cross a river. And while he helped her across, his foot got stuck in the mud, and he lost his sandal on one foot. Normally, walking into a town with one sandal would only get you mildly strange looks. But because the king was looking out for such a man, he had all his guards on high alert. "Don't worry about watching out for thieves and murderers," he said. "Just watch out for that man with one sandal." So as soon as Jason entered the city, he was snatched up and brought before the king. The king then looked at the young Jason and said out loud, "What would you do if the oracles told you a stranger was about to take your own life?" Jason responded by saying, "I would have them sent far away, to the edge of the earth, to the Caucasus specifically, to retrieve the golden fleece." Such a task was impossible and would ultimately claim the life of those sent to search of it. It was afterwards that Jason announced his identity to the king and his court, that he was the son of Aeson, rightful king to the throne. King Peleus did not deny his right to rule. but instead gave the offer that if Jason could retrieve the golden fleece, he would relinquish the throne of Thessaly. Jason, of course, accepted the offer, and the men in the king's court laughed at Jason as though he had volunteered for execution, for no man could return with the golden fleece. Jason accepted the offer and began preparations for the voyage. First, he needed a ship, and after that, a crew. After touring the ports, he secured the legendary ship, the Argo. With his ship now ready, Jason went in search of his crew, but he couldn't just choose any sailors, he needed the best. The most legendary heroes of ancient Greece. No man less than of a king or demigod would suffice.
The first man that Jason acquired for his crew was the legendary Heracles. Second, Jason sought after Peleus. And I bet you don't know who Peleus is, but I'm sure you know who his son is. Peleus is the father of Achilles. There were a lot of famous hunters and warriors who partook in this crew, but two of the famous heroes were the twins, Castor and Pollux. There were 20 heroes who accompanied Jason on the Argo, many of them sons of gods and famous warriors and hunters. One of them was a woman, a huntress known as Atalanta. Now that they had a strong crew of famous hunters and warriors, the crew took a vote on who should captain the Argo, and naturally they chose Heracles. I mean, who wouldn't? But Heracles understood that this was Jason's quest, and he relinquished command of the vessel to Jason. And now that the crew was assembled, and Jason was the captain, it was time to set sail. They left the port and sailed across the Aegean Sea and through the Bosphorus into the Black Sea to the frontier of the Caucasus. Their journey would take them to many places, but the first was the island of Lemnos. Here they found the island was filled with only women, and from the shore they looked very attractive, and they wanted to get a closer look. But as they got closer, they found these women had a very terrible smell. A smell so terrible that the Argonauts had to stay on board of the ship to keep themselves from vomiting. It is said that these women had murdered all of their husbands and stopped worshipping the god Aphrodite, so they were cursed with a terrible smell. It turns out, though, that being on a ship for more than a few days was enough for the men not to care about the terrible stench, and they were enticed to leave the boat and go ashore to have sex with these beautiful women. Beautiful but foul-smelling women. Only Heracles and a few others stayed on the ship. And it is funny because already it is proving that Heracles was a better choice of a captain. Days go by, then weeks, then months, and every day they are set to continue their voyage north when they decide to postpone their trip for one more day. Many of the crew ended up fathering children with the smelly women, and Jason himself had a set of twins with the queen. But finally, Heracles had enough, and he grabbed the rest of the Argonauts and Jason, and they left the island for good and set sail for the Black Sea. Of course, like any great adventure story, the heroes got lost at sea and ended up on an island inhabited by a strange group of people. These people were very kind to Jason and the Argonauts, and they invited them into their city to witness the crowning ceremony of their new king. Unfortunately, the island was also home to a group of giants with 6 arms. Jason and the crew went on the island to witness one of the nobles on the island get crowned king, and while they were watching the crowning ceremony, the giants tried to raid their anchored ship. Of course, Heracles was on board, and he killed most of the attackers. The local tribe felt awful, of course, and helped Jason and his men by restocking them and seeing them safely on their way to their destination.
Unfortunately, another storm brewed up, and the Argonauts were blown off course and landed on a strange island in the middle of the night. Because it was so dark, they couldn't see anyone on the shore of the island. But as soon as they heard rustling in the bushes, the entire crew charged with their swords swinging, and they massacred everyone on the shoreline. When the sun came up that morning, they saw that it was the same island of the friendly king who had just housed and clothed and fed them. They even found the body of the king who welcomed them into his land. Feeling it was too awkward to remain on the island, Jason set sail and never returned. They were back at sea, but the missteps along the way were starting to annoy the men on the boat. Jason was in charge, but he didn't seem to the others like he was up to the task. They didn't even want him as their captain in the first place. They all voted, and they voted for Heracles. Meanwhile, the boat landed on the shore so they could trek inland and fetch fresh water. It just so happened that it was Heracles' servant who was given the task to go find the water, and while he was away, he was abducted by water nymphs. So Heracles and his other servant went to rescue him. Once Heracles and his servants were off the ship, Jason ordered the rest of the crew to set sail, abandoning their companions. At first, no one noticed. But once they were at sea and had a chance to look around, they noticed 3 of their Argonauts were missing. The crew quickly accused Jason of deserting Heracles on purpose. They claimed he was threatened by Heracles. The crew had enough. They were sick of Jason and tired of his leadership. They started shouting at him. Mutiny was coming. Before the Argonauts had a chance to kill Jason, a god appeared out of the water and spoke to the crew. They told them it was the gods who intervened and took Heracles away, and not to blame Jason for their misfortunes. It seemed to work, as the crew settled down after that and accepted their captain. Maybe it was because a god told them, and maybe because without Heracles there was no better option for captain. The Argo set sail once again, and the ship and its crew sailed north. Their destination was the Caucasus. Their target, the Golden Fleece. This entire time they had been sailing in the Aegean Sea, but now they finally made it to the narrow straits in the north and crossed through to the Sea of Marmara. All this trouble, and they weren't even halfway. They're not even at the Black Sea yet. They're still in the Aegean when all this stuff happened.
When they landed on the coast to get supplies, a tribe of Thracians ambushed the crew and prevented the ship from leaving. They were a savage bunch of men who were living around the coast of Thrace and Anatolia, and they did not like the presence of these Greek men around their home. They were captured and brought before the king. Now the king was another brute, and he stood in front of the Argonauts and challenged them, any of them, to a fist fight to the death. The king really enjoyed beating men to death, and he didn't realize he was threatening the heroes and demigods from Greece. So Pollux took up the challenge, stepped forward, and waited for the king to strike. The king was a tall and stronger man, but Pollux was no fool, and he dodged the first few punches, then landed his own, and before long the king was on the ground, and Pollux got on top of him and punched him to death. The Thracian king was dead, and immediately the rest of the Thracians gathered around the Argonauts, threatening them and cursing them, but never fully engaging, just a mob surrounding them, shouting and screaming. And after a brief standoff, the Thracians ran away. It was time to leave, and so Jason and the others took whatever they could from the enemy encampment and carried it back to the boat, including several cattle. Now, after sailing up the Sea of Marmara, they landed outside of the Bosphorus, near the future city of Byzantium, where they encountered an old blind man sitting at a table. The old man told Jason and the Argonauts that he had been cursed by Zeus and was doomed to spend his life old, feeble, blind, and always hungry. The hunger part was strange because when Jason and the Argonauts looked at the old man, it was evident that he was sitting at a table filled with food. The table wasn't nicely set either. Instead, there were dishes thrown all over and food scattered across the tabletop, along with claw marks and feathers. Something was very strange here. The old man told the Argonauts that part of the curse from Zeus was that every time he attempted to eat, harpies would fly out of the sky and attack his food, clawing at it and soiling it until the food was ruined. Now, if you don't know what a harpy is, you can Google it, but just know it is a female eagle hybrid with the face, hair, and breasts of a woman and the body of a hawk. It also happened that this man was able to foresee events that had yet to happen, and therefore knew that the Argonauts were going to save him. And when he tried to take a bite of his food and the Harpies attacked, Jason and the Argonauts defended the old man and slayed the Harpies with their swords. The old man was so happy to be free from his curse that he helped the Argonauts plot their course to the Black Sea. There was one last obstacle before they could make it to the Black Sea, and that was passing through the gates of the moving rocks.
As Jason and the Argonauts sailed up the narrow strait, they approached an eerie point in the waterway. Two scary-looking cliffs towered over the narrow pass. They sailed close to it and waited. Just as the old man had advised, they set loose a dove, which flew ahead of the ship and through the narrow passageway. As soon as the bird was between the mountains, the two cliffs closed together like a Venus flytrap trying to catch a fly. They caught only the tail feathers of the bird, and as the cliffs slowly opened up, the Argonauts sailed as fast as they could through the narrow passageway before the cliffs could close again. And just like that, the Argonauts made it out of Thrace and into the Black Sea. They sailed along the coast of the Black Sea before they stopped at a small kingdom on the edge of a river. They were greeted by the men at the port, and the ship stopped to resupply their food and water stocks. While they were in this kingdom, they met a third king. But unlike the first two kings they met on their journey, they did not end up killing this one. Instead, the king found out that they killed the king in Thrace, who was the enemy of this particular kingdom. So the Argonauts were treated as heroes and were given the royal hospitality. This would have been one of the better stops for the crew, except for the fact that one of their crew got sick. His name was Typhus, and he was the pilot of the Argo. Unfortunately, Typhus later died from the sickness, and to make matters worse, another one of the Argonauts was out hunting boar when he was killed. The Argonauts ended up burying multiple crew members before setting sail. Luckily, the Argonauts stumbled upon a small island with 3 strangers, and they were quickly added to the crew. Now that they were fully crewed, they sailed up the coast of the Black Sea, only to stop at another river. Here they planned to rest for a while. They had been on the water for months, if not years, and they were getting really close to their final target in the Caucasus. They spent their first night in the harbor, but they quickly realized that this was the home of the Amazons, the warrior women and daughters of Ares, and they only cared for one thing: war. The crew immediately set sail the next morning and were forced to continue their journey without rest. Conveniently, the crew found a deserted island with a temple erected on the mound that was dedicated to the god Ares. This seemed like a perfectly safe place to spend the evening. When they got inside the temple, they found several young children. It turns out that these 4 survivors were the citizens of Caucasus and knew the land they were heading for very well. Jason thought it was perfect to have 4 locals on their ship, so he immediately welcomed them all on board.
For the first time throughout their entire journey, the crew laid their eyes on the Caucasus. They could see their target, but they didn't want to rush in and announce their arrival, so they quietly docked further up the coast. Jason and his crew left the ship and walked into the city and sought out an audience with the king. He figured if he were going to take the gold fleece, he might as well start off by asking nicely. So Jason and the Argonauts were brought before the king, and as soon as the men were inside of the court, the queen started weeping. It turns out that the 4 boys rescued on the abandoned island were the nephews of the queen. The 4 nephews of Medea asked the king for the golden fleece, but he didn't want to part with it and actually accused the young men of conspiring against their king. Jason saw the situation was quickly getting out of hand, so he pleaded with the king to come to some kind of arrangement where both parties could benefit. The king didn't want to part with the fleece, so he gave Jason a bunch of impossible tasks to complete and promised to give him the fleece if he completed all of them. Jason returned to the ship and told his crew the good news. The impossible task they were given all of those many months ago has finally resulted in a new king giving them even more impossible tasks to complete. They were utterly thrilled. And in the meantime, the mother of the 4 boys who joined Jason's crew begged the queen to help keep Jason and the Argonauts alive. She didn't want any harm to come to the young boys. And believe it or not, the first task given to Jason and the Argonauts was to plow a field of crops. And you might think, why is this a dangerous task? Well, these fields were currently occupied by fire-breathing oxen. Yeah, that's right, fire-breathing cows. And luckily the aunt of the 4 boys bestowed a spell upon Jason, which allowed him to wrestle the bulls without getting burned by their fiery breath. And once he beat the bulls into submission, he directed them up and down the fields until the soil was tilled. But once the fields were plowed, an army of warriors popped out of the ground and rushed Jason. Now, Jason couldn't defeat them all at once, as there were far too many, but he did throw a bunch of rocks at them, and it caused the warriors to turn on each other, and they ended up fighting themselves until there was no more. Jason had succeeded in the tasks given to him by the king of the Caucasus, and now it was time to get that damn fleece. He ventured into the forest until he came across the sacred tree with the golden fleece hanging from the branches. The fleece shined and sparkled in the night. And Jason quickly snuck up on the tree and saw that a giant serpent guarded the tree. There was no way he was going to get past a dragon. But the aunt of the 4 boys had anticipated this and gave Jason a potion. Once Jason got close enough to the dragon, he either poured or threw or fed the potion to the dragon, and the great beast fell asleep. Now Jason stepped over the sleeping dragon, snatched the golden fleece from the tree, and left. He had what he came for. Now it was time to go home. And yet this marks the halfway point of the journey, because it was time to go home. Their journey home was just as dangerous as their journey to the Caucasus. And to start it off with a bang, the entire Caucasus navy was in hot pursuit behind them. They wanted the golden fleece back, and they weren't going to stop until they captured Jason and the Argonauts, took the fleece back, and killed everyone on board. Fortunately for the Argonauts, they were able to escape the wrath of the pursuing navy and ended up back in the Aegean Sea. For now, they felt like they were getting close to home. But they still had encounters with the sirens, the harpies, and more mythological creatures. And after escaping all of them, they found that parts of the Caucasus fleet had been pursuing them this entire time and was now right behind them. Now they did manage to outrun the ships and get back home. And it didn't happen right away. But with the golden fleece now returned to his kingdom, Jason took his rightful place on the throne and ruled over the kingdom. His adventures continued, but for the sake of our story, we will leave it here. These stories are handed down through the ages, and were adjusted over time. But the actual source of these come from a man named Hesiod. And Hesiod wrote these legends around the year 800 BCE. This is around the same time that the Greeks adopted the new Phoenician alphabet. And what is interesting to ponder is that these stories and myths were actually an amalgamation of several legends and stories that were circulating around the many different cultures that lived in the area over the centuries. And the story about the Olympians overthrowing the Titans is a representation of one culture moving into Greece and overthrowing the old culture with a new one. Now, this could be a reference to the Dorians overthrowing the Achaeans, and before that, the Achaeans overthrowing the Minoans. And some say that these Greek legends took pieces from the rich cultures of the Middle East, which would make a lot of sense with the trade networks and migrations between the regions. Well, that's it for today. Join us next time on the history of modern Greece. Stay safe and stay awesome.